0247 hours of June 3rd of 2024. I want to talk about the full entity again. I've talked about this in the consciousness handbook material, but I need to brush up on material, so I may as well go ahead and share it again. So, how does consciousness break itself down to have different types of experience? To go ahead and answer this, we wish to go ahead and share what makes the different things of consciousness what they are. And this is their characterization. This is their self-characterization. This is their sense of being a particular thing. And so, when we look at this from the perspective of Source, because it has no set variables, because it has no set character, it's able to express as any conceivable thing. The first character attribute that you set to something now means that the consciousness expresses within the confines of that character attribute. So when we look at things like the archangel level, on this level, consciousness assigns itself a character attribute, and there are 13 possible single character attributes on this level. This is what makes the idea of the archangel and what makes it 1/13 of creation. So now consciousness expresses within the confines of this. So here's the thing. If we look at things, or if we look directly at Source itself, there are all of the possible attributes that it has. When we say possible attributes, well, the reason we say that's going to become apparent very quickly, very soon. So, in the instance of these possible attributes, there are many components of consciousness that Source has that are completely open. Once it sets a piece of consciousness as something specific, it's no longer able to express as every conceivable thing. Because now it's no longer looking at life from the perspective of itself. It's looking at life from the perspective of a piece of itself. The piece that falls within the confines of that character attribute. And in that way, it's no longer living from its perspective, but from the perspective of an archangel in this case. Now, an archangel is a term that a lot of people use to describe a very grand piece of consciousness. An alternate term to use is perhaps the Oversoul great grand family. That's the term that I like to use. Where you can look at Source, or rather creation, as the body of all things. And so in that way, it's the family of everything. So once you go ahead and define a character attribute for yourself, you express within the confines of that character attribute. If you assign more character attributes of yourself, if you decide to freeze more of your pieces of consciousness in place and define yourself as those traits, you express within the confines of those traits. So you can see how you're narrowing the band of the perspective that you take. So now you go ahead and bring yourself from 13th density, which is that of the family of all of consciousness, the family of all things, the family of, we're not thinking of the word, it has escaped us, the family of all souls, yes, the family of all oversouls, down to the archangel, or the great grand family, and yet more attributes set in place. You're to 11th density, and the great-great-grand family, and you can set more attributes of yourself, more of your pieces of consciousness to static, or more character traits that you're living from the perspective of. Instead of leaving them open, you set them to something so you can experience what it's like to be that character, down to 10th density, a great grand family of oversouls, and you set more traits, more character traits, and you're at 9th density to the grand family of oversouls, and you can set more attributes, more pieces of consciousness into place. Now you're 8th density, the family of oversouls, and you can set yet even more attributes. And now you're at 7th density, the oversoul itself, the individual oversoul. Now, the thing that all of those levels have in common is that there's no lower fractal consciousness and higher fractal consciousness. You're still experiencing life from the perspective of the full entity. So, when we go ahead and break the consciousness down even further, by defining more character attributes. Now, with that said, actually, I want to go ahead and iterate the logic behind the wording break down consciousness. When we look at the family of all things, when we look at Source, that's able to express as anything, that lives from the perspective of everything. When it breaks into 12th density, or sets a character attribute, or lives from the perspective of a single, a character with a single attribute, it breaks itself into pieces. It lives from the perspective of each of the 13 components of the 12th density layer. There's only one component to 13th density. That component is everything. There's 13 components in the 12th density. Each one of those corresponds to a 13th of all of creation. That's why we say break down the consciousness. You're experiencing a narrower band of it. You're not exactly breaking it into pieces. You're breaking the 12th density into pieces, and then or you're breaking the 13th density into pieces and experiencing a piece of it. The same thing works going from 6th density to 4th density, but we're going to break into detail what makes 1st through 6th density different from 7th through 13th. So when we look at the idea of setting more character attributes for yourself, well, before we can really look at that, we need to go ahead and define an oversoul and share what an oversoul actually is. So, you've taken on so many character attributes that make you an oversoul of creation. And when I look at my own self, like listen to me talk, feel my character, feel my being, feel my entity, feel what I am as I share. What do you see? What do you feel? You feel a human being talking into his mic in a studio. You feel, perhaps depending on your levels of empathy and levels of connectedness with my being and its different layers, you feel my story, you feel my physicality, you feel my life, you feel my character in a different context, where when I said character one time, the first time, I was referring to what makes the character that is my human being. What makes Tat. That's the character of which I speak. When I said character the second time, I was more referring to the mood of my being in the moment. I can be happy, I can be sad, I can be rich, I can be poor. When I say rich and poor, I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about a grander sense of abundance, where it analogs to a plant, a healthy plant, big, green, blooming, or a poor plant, wilting, not with much food, maybe even ravaged by pests. There are two states of being. that have many, many different expressions depending on the different forms that you look at. So my mood, perhaps that character. So you can connect to all of these different facets of my being here. But let's say that you go ahead and connect to another entity. An entity, doesn't matter whether it's anywhere in the first or sixth density. And you connect with this entity. An entity reminds you very distinctly of me. And you connect to another entity. That entity also reminds you very distinctly of me and also very distinctly of the other entity. There are character traits that the three of us, in spite of being a vastly different species, have in common. Now let's say you go really far out and connect to another entity that isn't even from this physicality. And yet again, that entity distinctly reminds you of me and my character. The first one, not the second one. This gives you a scope of the Oversoul, because the Oversoul is the character essence itself. It's able to express it as any physicality, because the parts of consciousness that make life physical are not set. They're open, free to move, they're liquid, they're fluid. They're not frozen, they're not solid, they're not static. All of Source's consciousness is fluid. It's free-flowing, it's movable, it's liquid. You see how this works? So you're freezing consciousness in place to be that of a certain character, to take the perspective of a specific character. This is how you create an avatar to exist in a specific race of being that lives within a much narrower band of consciousness. Now that element of avatar causes us to have to go into the co-creational dynamic. We'll go ahead and do that right quick before we go ahead and share about breaking consciousness down to be in a physicality, although some of you who are really astute may have already figured it out. So, with the idea of creating an avatar, the co-creational dynamic comes into play. And the co-creational dynamic, I like to iterate this way. From the perspective of two beings, being A and being B. You know, maybe we'll get back to that. I want to go ahead and actually share how to be in the sixth density first, because, well, you'll see why. So you're that oversoul, you're that character with all of the consciousness that makes physicality physical, being liquid, being fluid. Now let's say you freeze some of that consciousness in place. What that looks like is now the full entity, which is all of reality, all of happening, all of occurrence around you, which is free and flowing, and perfectly and instantaneously mirrors your being. In other words, you are your reality, completely and totally, fully integrated in it. You feel all of its components. You can move anything at your leisure and have it behave in any way you want to. Now let's say that it's behaving a certain way and you freeze it in place. You have these parts of your consciousness behave in that way statically. Now you've just assigned some physics to your reality, be they in a first density sense or in a second density sense with instinct structure, and there being thematic patterns to the behaviors of different beings in the instinct way, or in the third density sense in certain patterns of emotionality and that kind of thing, or in the fourth layer sense in patterns of different things that are experienced in any moment, and a lack of variation from those things. And the fifth and sixth density are really not that much different in a lot of ways. with the fifth density, or the fifth layer, being that of specific phenomena and themes of phenomena, things that you become wise to in the thematic exploration of fifth density. And then the sixth layer, that being spectra of connectedness, and different things that you experience that are part of your consciousness. Seventh density involves the connectedness to all things that are part of your full entity in the moment. So, in that way, to go from seventh to sixth density, you're setting some kind of physics, be they physics of character or physics of material, you name it. And you set even more physics, more of your consciousness into staticness, if you will, into solidity, to go ahead and move down to the fifth density, where now you're not experiencing as big of scope of what things can do when they're in fluidity, when they're able to be a grander portion of the scope of what can be been by source. So, or in this instance, perhaps you could also say what can be been by your oversoul. Remember, the entity is the reality. It's not a being within the reality, such as my human being within the earth and the universe that I'm in. So when we look at life in that way, you're looking at larger or smaller scopes of happenings and the things, the different things that the stuff, that the people, that the items in your reality tend to do. You can set even more things into solidity. You can go ahead and assign even more character traits, your consciousness to be specific things, to go down into the fourth density, like where I'm at right now. Here, the majority of my consciousness as a full entity has been set to work automatically, has been set to be specific things, to behave in specific ways. So there are physics to my reality, there are some things that my reality tends to do, and some things that my reality tends to not do. Some things that I tend to experience, some things that I tend to not experience. And then there's my own programming as a being here. The scope of what I do and what I tend to not do. And the patterns by which I do things that make me as a human what I am, and that make me a human instead of a Bigfoot or a dolphin or a dragonfly, that kind of thing. So there's my distinctive behavior patterns, thing that make me different from a Pleiadian being or an Arcturian being. All three of us have different second density setups, and that goes into the instinct structure. And yes, I can go ahead and set even more of my consciousness in place to where I live within a singular physicality and a singular timeline, instead of being able to shift within a larger spectrum of what my physicality is able to express as, where I can express in a multitude of different timelines or a multitude of different races. Now I live a single race, single timeline. And let's say I put even more of my consciousness, I freeze up even more of my consciousness, set its character. Now I'm second density, and I only live from the perspective of instinct, as the rest of my reality around me moves and does different things. I have programs, I have subroutines, I'm experiencing a very small piece of my reality. As the rest of the reality moves around me. In this way, I'm living, I'm acting more like I'm the being within the reality rather than the reality itself. And I'm experiencing the reality as it happens around me. let's say I set so much of my consciousness into place that now I don't have any programming, just a few character traits, or just a few I don't know how to word this. Like my particle is that of a few attributes, and my fluidity is next to none. Everything around me is set, and I'm just existing as a part of it. That's first density. That's what atoms and molecules are. That's what objects are. That's what electricity is. It's a really interesting thing. There's how you go from source to first density. So with that said, how does the co-creational dynamic work? Well, remember those character traits? What different things I can set my reality to behave as? So the co-creational dynamic is how two fractals, two entities, which are both parts of the same whole, share reality, share experience with each other, as elements of consciousness within each of them come and go. So, to create, or co-create, if you will, you are technically creator in a way. You experience the consciousness of another. So that means part of their body of consciousness, part of their reality starts to match your reality. And in that way, you two are literally sharing being. And this is why they say co-creating, because you both are creating the same reality. You're creating together. So, in this way, here I am, entity A, with entity B. We're sharing a reality. So there's a dynamic that I like to share behind this, because how does this work? Don't you have a free will to experience anything? Because even being that of a fourth density entity, are you still source, or are you just that fourth density entity? You're living from the perspective of the fourth density entity. But remember, source is able to express as anything. Therefore, I am this human being called the atom twister. I am also source. So, I am also that of an archangel. I am also that of a 11th density being. I hold consciousness that is a piece of the soul, the great grand family of oversouls. I also am a piece of my oversoul. And my essence is that of the oversoul. My essence is that of source. I'm living from the perspective of a small piece of that, but they're all different layers of my being. Given that source is my essence, it's my spark of life, I have the ability to go ahead and shift elements of my character. I have the ability to experience whatever I want. And so I'm choosing right now, having set these character traits to experience myself from the perspective of this human. And this actually answers a question of mine that I've actually been exploring lately. How do I go beyond that which I am? And the answer is simple. Change the character traits of the consciousness that I'm living from the perspective of. So, in that way, I feel myself as I'm having myself be. I can change those traits, and in that way, move on from this or expand the scope of this. So that is how I go ahead and move my consciousness. That's how I go ahead and move the perspective. That's how I go from living the human being of this character to living this human being in a little bit of a different character. That's something I've been wanting to do for a long time. So why haven't I iterated a co-creational dynamic yet? Because the old way that I would do it didn't feel right, and I didn't have a new way planned. So let's go ahead and just use the old way and build upon it. So the old way I iterated the co-creational dynamic is that A is part of B is part of A. Hence, they share parts of the body of consciousness, or even the entire body of consciousness in some cases, and are just living from different perspectives of that same body of consciousness. A can only be what B has A be. In other words, I am part of B. B has a free will. I can only be what B has me be. But B is of my character. B is a part of me. Life is that of my own character of it. It is me as an entity. Therefore, B, I choose the version of B that I experience, and therefore the version of B's choice of me. That's how B and A can both freely choose the versions of each other that they experience. In creation, or rather, let's do it this way. Source has the ability to experience whatever variation on my human being that it wants to. That means any timeline, any moments sequentially after this one. There are so many different variations on me that go outward spherically in a way from my moment now. Different variations on what I am. And the farther away you get from the moment, the larger the number of variations you can have, basically. The larger the amount of variation from a specific version of me, the greater number of possibilities for expression that are varied from the momentary expression by that amount that there are. So if you're looking at an entity that is X, that is different from me by X amount, there's a number of variations on that. The number of variations on an entity that's different from me, 2x from me, is much, much greater. There are many, many, many more possible structures of being that are 2x different from me from what there are 1x different from me. Many more. So, that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So in this way, if B wants to be a reflection and expression of my consciousness, it would have to shift into that which exists within the confines of my character of life. That way, its reality's character can match my reality's character, and so in that way, it can have the same reality as me, in which it and me can interact with each other. You see how that works? So, let's say Aradif wants to come visit me right now. My consciousness exists within a certain character. This is a fairly narrow band. Aradif has a lot more consciousness in liquidity, a lot more consciousness in fluidity, and therefore his consciousness has a lot more room to take a myriad of different forms. He can go experience other races, and those other races express within the confines of how he has life be for himself. A larger scope of character means a much wider confine. So that means that other races are able to express within the scope of Aradif's character. Other planets are able to express within the scope of Aradif's character. When we look at planets and planetary collective consciousnesses, if we look at mine, for instance, or specifically my race's collective consciousness, there are certain things that tend to happen within that collective and certain other things that tend to not happen. There's the way in which we collectively have life be as we share it with each other. Aradif and his people are able to perceive a much grander scope of different things that they can be. Their lower fractal consciousness encompasses a much wider scope of consciousness than that of which our lower fractal consciousness encompasses. So when the full entity splits into two pieces, it lives from the perspective of what we call the lower fractal consciousness. The perspective that it lives from is what we call the lower fractal consciousness. The rest of the full entity is the higher fractal consciousness. Most of Aradif's consciousness is lower fractal consciousness. Most of my consciousness is higher fractal consciousness. So in that way, I'm living a lot less of my full entity than Aradif is. This is why Aradif says to go up into densities is to, the fastest way to go up into densities is to simply be your own self. You're literally integrating, to go up the densities, you're integrating into more of yourself. The self being defined as, in this case, the full entity. So you're literally being more of the full entity. You're literally living from more of your full entity's perspective. The full entity encompasses the entire scope of your reality. So, when we look at Aradif, he's being a lot more of his full entity than I am. So, he's able to perceive so much more and experience so much more of his oversoul than I am with the character traits that I have. So I've broken down my consciousness from the oversoul perspective. I've broken it down much, much more to experience this perspective than Aradif has to experience his perspective. So here's another variation on the wording. Life is what I have it be. I can have it be something large or something small. I have it be something relatively small. I have it be something specific rather than something grand or vague, if you will. And so the scope of what Aradif has life be, he experiences a little bit at a time. The scope of what I have life be, I also experience a little bit at a time, but perhaps a bit of a smaller bit at a time. Where with Aradif, there are so many different proclivities of happening, so many different phenomena that are able to exist as part of his consciousness, but he only experiences a few of those at a time. There's a lot less that are able to exist as part of my reality, where my reality is much more local. So for Aradif to join me here, he would have to go ahead and experience the part of his consciousness that can be my consciousness, where his reality and mine can be the same reality, and his reality and what can be his reality, given his character as it is now, encompasses a much larger amount of consciousness than mine. Now remember, you can change your character, so in the technical sense, anything can be your reality, because you have the freedom to experience the source, which is exactly what you're doing right now. So, that's an interesting thing to kind of look at for me. So what I'm working to do now is getting to understand my character. What makes me what I am? What makes me what I am is myself, my choice of being. I choose to live from the perspective of this human being with these character traits. So I can choose to do whatever I want with that. This is just me learning now. I'm learning this stuff too. So I may know it, but I'm also learning it. You can know something and be learning something at the same time. So, this is how the different beings work. So if Aradif wants to create with me, he can live from a perspective that exists within the confines of my character. And that's a small piece, a small portion of the grander consciousness that is what he can be. So for me to learn to be 6th density, I would have to see and live from the perspective of consciousness that can be a lot more than what I'm being. It can be a lot more than just the character of life that I have, a lot more than my current human traits, my current human life, my current human physicality, and the different things that happen in it. And I want to go ahead and actually share a little bit about traits of consciousness. How do you assign traits to consciousness? Well, your body of consciousness encompasses everything in your reality. The atoms, the items, the people, the planet, any object, everything, even thought patterns, even the proclivities of different entities and different beings. So, everything around me behaves within within the confines of a certain character. In that way, that's what makes my reality what it is. It all, however, because everything is source expressing itself in different forms, it has a fundamental infiniteness. Everything around me is the same source that I am, able to be anything. So if I want to rewrite its character and choose to live from the perspective, or to choose to live a life with different character, I can do exactly that. So for me to go visit Aradif and to fully experience his entire 6th density self, I would need to open my consciousness to all of the different things that Aradif's consciousness is open to where everything and everyone in my reality has the capacity to move as life does for Aradif, where my life and my things in it are able to move and change the way Aradif's is. In that way, I would be able to instantly shift to different versions of reality. I would be able to live different versions of the way things play out. I would be able to live different timelines. I would be able to live different planets. And the consciousness that is around me, everything that's around me, would be able to cease being what it is and start being something else. Now, it's a little bit of a difficult thing to kind of share, because we're not saying that, like, let's say my mother in the other room ceases to exist. More like I discontinue experiencing that and I'm now experiencing another portion of myself. Well, it's not quite that. I'm discontinuing experiencing it from the perspective of my physical body, but it's still part of my consciousness. Even if the reality that my physical self is in, or that my lower fractal consciousness and its host is in, is vastly different from where I just was experiencing. But the scope of my consciousness permits me to continue experiencing where I was at before, even when the new thing. So I'm able to remember and feel and connect with the previous experience, because I'm living from a perspective that can experience all of it. It's a hard thing to put into words, because the fluidity of Aradif's world is quite great, but it's also not total. So I would feel what my atoms, what my reality is. I'd feel what makes it what it is. And I would feel my spark, my source, myself in everything around me. And this is how I would be with orative. So you can go up the densities and you can go down the densities. So breaking down your consciousness, and this is why the Arcturians did not opt to break into detail how to create avatars. It's very easy to do, it's very quick to do, but explaining it, that's not so quick to do for this mode. Because I had to go into detail with all this prerequisite stuff to really kind of share how to break your consciousness into avatars. You're just experiencing one of the many, like if you're in a higher density and your consciousness is able to be a wide variety of different things, to go experience a lower density race and exist within the confines of how they have life be, you would be going to experience a very small portion of your overall consciousness. And existing within those confines that they have life be so that they can see you and you can see them. So that's how to do it. It's actually it really is that easy. So that is how to go ahead and create avatars. That's how to go ahead and do different things. You can do it in reverse by feeling different dynamics with different layers of your own consciousness to experience the higher densities. All you would need to do is be open to a portion of yourself that's able to perceive a larger capacity of being in things, the capacity of being in the whole array of character traits that, say, Trebor Yetni is able to experience. A portion of me is able to see that, so I can go be with Trebor Yetni with a layer of my consciousness right this moment. But for me to experience that with my host, with my body, I would have to know, feel, and perceive that on my physical sense. That's a bit of a bigger job in a way, but it's not impossible. And it's not really fundamentally a bigger job because you can shift to a different version of your physical self instantly if you like. But you could also build into it, which is what I'm doing. There's a lot more work to do that. But it's pretty fun. So there's that. That's how to do avatars in both directions. You can build portions of consciousness that can do avatars in the higher densities, and you can go ahead and learn yourself well enough to experience different types of characters of life. You can see, you can learn how to understand what different beings are when their consciousness and yours are shared, and in that way understand how co-creation works. A is a part of B, B is a part of A. A can only be how B has A be, but A chooses the version of B that A experiences. All that. Sharing bodies of consciousness. Your body of consciousness is everything that's a part of your reality, including your physical self. Anything that's a part of your experience in any capacity, that's your body of consciousness. You can live from the perspective of the whole body or a small piece of it. In the instance of the Oversoul, you're living from the perspective of the whole body. Even if you're only seeing from the perspective of part of it, you're living from the perspective of all of it, because all of that is your immediate being that you can feel. It isn't set to behave a certain way. It's not static, it's dynamic, it's fluid. Here, on the other hand, it's static. It's set. I've set it to behave a certain way, and I'm living from the perspective of a body that doesn't feel that, so I can have the adventure rather than focus on creating it. And so, all these different ways in which things behave. I didn't really hit on as much as I would like to the idea of going up the densities. We talked a lot about breaking down consciousness to go down to densities because we were inspired to do this after listening to the Arcturians speak. But now, with the idea of going up the densities in play, we want to go ahead and break into a little bit more detail how to do that, because it's really simple. Remember we talked about solidity and fluidity of consciousness, and how when you're open to everything being and you're able to express as anything, that's total fluidity. Total fluidity of physics, total fluidity of character. In that way, you're able to live from and experience, live from the perspective of or experience absolutely whatever you want. So, if you are experiencing a lot of physics, a lot of set character, and you want to go ahead and experience beyond that, you're opening up to more of the character that can be. There's what is being, and there's what can be. You shift consciousness from the state of being something specific to the state of openness to being. That way you have more consciousness fluid. This works in 1st through 6th density. This also works in 7th through 13th density, where in the 1st through 6th density, you're just seeing more capacity to be in everything around you, and you're no longer holding sharply defined ways of being for certain parts of your consciousness. And you're letting go of those definitions of ways of being and opening up to all of the ways in which that consciousness can be, and in that way you are living directly through the consciousness around you a lot more. And so in that way, it's able to freely move and shift with your consciousness as you're desiring to experience it, which in a way it already is. You're just choosing for it to be something specific and to stick with that, versus choosing in the higher densities to do whatever you want with it on a whim. So, where now it's part of your lower fractal consciousness, you're living from its perspective, you're living from the perspective of its character traits, and you're able to move and shift those. Now, you can redefine your character without going up the densities. And in that way, what you're doing is you're reassigning consciousness. You're reassigning the character of your life from being one thing to being something else. But you're not experiencing the previous scope of what it was. If you want to experience the previous scope and a new scope, you're going up the density a little. So, because now you're looking from the perspective of both ways of being instead of from the perspective of one way at a time. Now, it is true that you can go ahead and divide your consciousness a bit, such as the way we do in the human structure with the multi-density / multi-dimensional structure, where we have builds that are able to perceive a very great deal. The idea of imagination and how free-flowing that is. That's a 6th density construct. And then there are other layers, layers of dream state that are more 5th density. They're not quite as free-flowing, but they're still a lot more free-flowing than where our hosts are. So, we actually did touch on how to create those constructs. This message isn't just for humans, this is a message for extraterrestrials as well. Because there are a lot of extraterrestrials that do not have the kind of multi-density builds that humans do. This is how to construct these different facets that we touch on briefly in the previous section of this audio. So, this is how to go up the density. You just go ahead and open up to more being. You unfreeze your consciousness. So what does this look like on the Oversoul level and higher, the 7th density level and higher? Well, on this level, you are the full entity. So what you're doing is experiencing a larger scope of conscious expression, where before you were living from the perspective of the Oversoul's character. The Oversoul family character has room enough for all of the individual Oversouls that are part of that Oversoul family to express within. Hence, living from the perspective of the Oversoul family. So you're living from the perspective that can perceive and be all of the Oversouls of that Oversoul family. So that means you're open to being much more than you're open to being in the idea of just an individual oversoul. That's how this works. You're just opening up to a larger scope of being instead of sticking with a smaller scope of being. And that's it. You open up and you integrate into the larger scope of being. That's all there is to it. So going up the density is actually very simple. But we should highlight that here, if you're doing that with a body such as mine, there could be a lot of feeling around to fully appreciate your ability to do these things. And yes, it is true, that is a way of, perhaps you could say, complicating it. Fundamentally, it's not complicated, it's not complex. Going up the density is extremely simple. It just depends on the way in which you want to experience the adventure of doing that. So, as I'm here on my journey wanting to go up and experience the 6th density, to go visit Aradif and his race, I would need to know and feel and perceive from the perspective of my lower fractal consciousness the capacity of life around me to be able to do anything. Or at least be able to do all of the things that Aradif and his race's lives are able to do. So that way I can go be with his collective. So that's how that works. That's another brief rundown on how to go up the densities. So, the more you feel yourself, the more you understand what your life is and how it moves with your being. The little secret, or it's not really so secret, the level on which you choose to experience any kind of character is your source. It's sort of your spark of life. When you perceive the thing that makes people say cogito ergo sum, and you fully appreciate that, you'll realize that that has the capacity to experience anything. And that's how you know that experiencing any structure of life is a choice. When you see that capacity to choose, it becomes easy to go ahead and choose the same life or to choose different life. You're now literally choosing directly from the spark, which is something that people also call the heart. The heart of all things, your essence, what you really are. There's some interesting thoughts that you could come up with that if you watch the previous video. What was the previous video even about? I don't remember. I was talking about type 1 being, that's right. And what makes a type 1 being. So, there's that. Hope you all find that useful. Well, we hope that you find that all useful and find new things within yourself that you haven't seen before and are able to answer many of the questions that you have in life using this material and are able to go ahead and do new things that you didn't perceive your ability to do before. Cheers, everybody. We love you all very much, and we thank you for stopping by the House of Tat. And we bid you adieu for the video. Adieu.